Everyone, I'm Abigail, this is Megan, and welcome to another Two Kids interview.
We are joined by award-winning author Katrina Nannestad.
Some of these award-winning books include Werewolves, Rabbit Soldier, Angel Thief,
When Mischief Came to Town, Waiting for the Storks,
and the wonderful book series including The Traveling Bookshop,
The Girl, the Dog, and the Writer,
The Dirt Diaries,
Olive Groves, and more.
And what it is also really cool, Ms. Nannestad is joining us from the future.
Future?
Yes, it's June 20th for us and June 21st for her. What would you call that?
A different time between us and Australia.
I guess, but that's not as fun.
Still really cool. And thank you for being with us.
We really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me along. It's lovely to meet you.
A number of your powerful award-winning books are historical fiction.
What attracts you to historical fiction?
And how much research is involved in writing it?
I think I actually just got into writing war stories a little bit by accident, actually. Most of my writing had been action and mystery and humour, like the Girl, the Dog and the Writer series and Oliver Groves. But I was actually looking online for something and I stumbled across an article about the Wolfskinder. And I'd never actually heard of the Wolfskinder before. So I read the article and then I followed the links at the bottom of the story, and I was fascinated by these stories of children who were left surviving all on their own at the end of World War II in East Prussia. And so that really sparked something in me, and I mentioned it to my publisher and she said, that sounds like a great story idea. And so I embarked on this journey of writing the story of the Wolfskinder, which is heavily inspired by true events at the end of World War II. And that really set me on a new path with my writing. So while I was researching We Are Wolves, I came across the story about a little child soldier, Sergei Oleshkov, who's believed to be the youngest child to have served in World War II. And he was somewhere between 6 and 8 years of age when he joined the Red Army during World War II. And again, I thought, wow, here's an amazing story I haven't heard of before. So I started looking into it and wrote my story, Rabbit Soldier, Angel Thief. And so by that stage, I realised just how much I really, really enjoyed writing historical fiction. And that's something I'm continuing to do now. So as far as you asked about the research that I do for my stories, I do a lot of research for the war stories. I'm very aware that when I'm writing these stories, I'm writing about things that happen to real people. And so I need to be really respectful of the true stories. So I need to make sure I'm accurate in how I tell the stories. Obviously, my characters are fictional and their journey, their personal journey is fictional, but they are doing things and experiencing things that real people have experienced. So I do a huge amount of reading. I get a lot of books that deal with the subjects, whether it's first-hand accounts in autobiographies or journalists who've recorded people's responses to those events. I look at history books, I watch movies, I watch podcasts, I look at photographs on Google Images. Photographs that are taken during those eras are so powerful, hold so much information. I really just grasp whatever information I can get on a topic. And I often tell people research is whatever gives you a better understanding of a topic. So anything that gives me a better understanding, I grab hold of it and consume it before and during my writing of these stories.
Can it be hard to take a dark topic and make the story uplifting in the end?
Yes, and it is. It's also the challenge because I'm writing for children, not adults. So there has to be, I have to be aware that my stories need to be entertaining and uplifting and also age appropriate for children. But I think it's no matter what I read about war stories, there's so much horrible stuff goes on, but there are always accounts of people who make astonishingly wonderful choices, even when you think it's so hard for them to make good choices and kind choices. And I think there's always stories of hope and survival and kindness and love amidst all the horrors of war. And so I try to grab those bits and make them shine throughout my stories. And I always aim to have my stories ending on a happy note for my characters. I think we all want a happy ending and a sense of hope from the stories we read.
What made you decide to write for kids instead of adults?
Oh, that's a good question. I used to be a school teacher. I used to teach primary age children, which in Australia is children from 5 to 12 years of age. And so that's my world of experience work-wise, and a lot of my understanding of children comes from those times teaching. And of course I raised my own children, and I just always loved in the classroom, and when I was raising my own two boys, I loved the magic of sharing stories with children. And I love that a story can draw a whole class or a little family into a whole new world, and that story often lives on after the page has closed, the last page has closed. It lives on in your conversation and in the words you use and the games you play. And so I think I just really had a fascination for the power of stories in children's lives. And that's what led me to write about those things. I have tried to write for adults, but I find I often end up putting cute things in, like, ducklings swimming in the bathroom sink and things like that. So what I naturally come back to that writing for children and writing in a way that's appropriate for children.
What writer has had the most influence on you?
Oh, yeah, that's a tricky question. I think it's often hard to pinpoint because we're influenced by everything we read and watch, aren't we? But I'd say one of the writers who I've found incredibly influential is an Australian author called Maurice Gleitzman. And he is a very clever writer who writes about very serious topics for children, but in a way that's accessible and even has humour. And so I find him incredibly inspiring. I also love A.A. Milne, who wrote Winnie the Pooh. Do you know the story Winnie the Pooh, the English series? Their stories written for children about animals, and yet there's so much cleverness and humour in there for everyone, for children and adults. So I love his portrayal of characters and the cleverness of his language. So I think that's a real influence on me too. And of course, I love reading adult fiction that's funny. I really love reading the works of Jane Austen and an author called Gerald Durrell, who writes a lot about animals, and P.G. Woodhouse, and they all write a lot of humour, and I think I've been very influenced by those funny writers as well.
How do you come up with the ideas for your books?
Oh, I think my mind's always full of ideas. When people talk about having an ideas block or writer's block, I don't really understand that from a point of view of not having ideas. I think what I do is then I hone in on the idea that is shouting the loudest in my mind at the time, that I think is the best idea for a novel for children. And once I hone in on that idea, I do a whole series of activities that help me work out what I'm going to use for that story. So I do a lot of mind mapping and drawing and list making and mess making, really. I draw lots of pictures while I'm planning, and then I don't let anything stand in my way. I don't think, is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea for this story? Is this a sensible character? Is it a silly character? I just put all my ideas down. I let everything that's crowding my head spill out onto the page, and then I arrange my ideas into a sensible sort of plan for a story. But I think ideas are just everywhere. I can be sitting at a cafe and I can hear I'm so sorry. And I can hear a snippet of a conversation, or I can see a person who looks really interesting, or it might be a piece of cake before me. There's just ideas exploding everywhere. And I suppose I just pick those things and shove them in my mind, and they pop out somewhere along the way when I'm planning the next story.
What is your process when putting a novel together?
Do you decide the end before the middle?
Or do you put it together in order?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think often I start with the big idea, like the general idea of what the story will be about, or sometimes I start with a character, and as I get to know that character through all that mess making and note taking and drawing, the central problem in their life will come together. But I think I probably start with the problem. When I'm planning how the story's going to run, I start with the big problem, that thing that'll make that big climax of the story, that we're building up and up and up to. And then I'll work out, well, how's this going to end for the character? How's the story going to be solved? So it's quite, I think I probably go problem, ending, and then think of what's going to build up to that problem and the ending. So maybe starting in the middle, then the end, and then the beginning. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Is there any character you've written that you feel the most connected to?
I have characters who I think I always put a little bit of myself into my characters, into my main characters. I don't think I can help doing that because I find it easier to describe a character if I relate to them. So, for instance, Tobias Appleby in The Girl, the Dog and the Writer is an absent-minded writer, and that's very much modelled on me. I'm quite absent-minded and get lost in my stories when I'm writing a novel, and we see that in Tobias Appleby. Or, for instance, in Dirt Diaries, Blue Weston is really modelled a lot on me when I was that age of about 11 years of age. So I put myself into my characters a lot. But if I had to choose the character that I love the most, I would have to say it's a little boy called Pippin in The Girl, the Dog and the Writer in Provence. And Pippin's the little next door neighbour, and he wasn't meant to be a main character. He was just meant to be this little neighbour sitting off to the side of the story. But as I started writing about this character, he just became this gorgeous, larger-than-life character. And I fell so in love with him that I really wanted to take him on to the next story in that series, but I couldn't because he had to stay at home with his mother and his grandmother, of course. But I really fell in love with him just because he was so sweet, and he seemed to take on a life of his own and muscle his way into top place in this story, which was really exciting for me as a writer.
How much of being a writer is being observant?
I think a huge part of being a writer is observing, sitting back and watching the world around you. Whether it's people, if you're watching people, even to notice if someone's confident, how do they hold their body? How do they look at you? What do they do with their hands? If they're shy, what do they do with their body? Do they, put their hair over their face? Do they fidget? Do they chew the arms of their glasses? All those little mannerisms I love watching in people, and I love using those to describe my characters because they make them so real and believable. But also just watching the broader world around you, whether it's a scene, and if you're sitting in a place like a cafe, to think, well, what can I hear as well as what can I see? What can I smell? What do I taste? What are people doing around me? So observing is such a big part of that, because if you want to describe a scene or a person or an action scene or a setting in a story, you need to be aware of what those things would be like in real life. You want the reader to believe that this could be true, that I really could be here experiencing this.
What advice do you have for young people who want to write?
I think my first piece of advice would be to write often, even if it's just 5 minutes a day. Like, get into the habit of writing, even if you're just having a little bit of fun every day. Like I often just sit down, if I've got a few minutes while I'm in a waiting room or something, I'll write some story starters. It might be a sentence, it might be 3 sentences, it might never go on to become a story. But in doing that, I'm actually using my imagination and exercising my writing skills. So writing is a skill like learning ballet or learning a new language or learning the piano. And the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. Also, the more you do those sorts of creative snippets of writing, the more your imagination gets whirring and gets used to being active and creative. My other advice would be to write about what excites you. So whatever is your passion, your interest, I think that's what you should write about. So if you love ballet, write ballet stories. If you love reading romance novels, write romance novels. If you love fairy tales, make up your own fairy tales, because I think when we're writing about the things that we love, that's when we do our best writing. And also then you start with a wealth of knowledge that you already have about the topic that makes it so much easier to write.
Have you visited each of the countries that your books are set in?
I've visited a number of the countries. I used to live in Denmark. My husband's Danish. And so the girl who brought Mischief is set on the island of Bornholm, which is a Danish island, which I've visited, and talks a lot about Danish culture, which I'm familiar with. And I've travelled around Europe quite a bit. So a number of my books, like All the Girl, the Dog, the Writer books, are set in places where I've visited. When I was writing the travelling bookshop, it was during COVID. And so I set a few of the stories in places I hadn't been to, but I actually wanted to go to. And so with the one that's set in the Netherlands and the one that's set on a Greek island, I've never been to those places, but I was able to travel through my research and in my imagination while I was writing those stories, which was great fun. We had quite a lot of lockdowns here in Australia where we couldn't even leave our homes except to go grocery shopping. So it was lovely to travel in our imaginations, in my imagination at that time. So most of my stories are in places I've been. But of course, the war stories, there's no way I can visit some of those places. And also, I obviously can't be in the situation during wartime. Borders have changed. Everything's changed since then. So then I really depend on really intensive research to get an idea of those places and those situations.
When you are writing a sequel in a book series,
Did you ever wish you had done something differently in an earlier book?
maybe something that would have set up the sequel?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Yes, I haven't really come across that I can think of. I suppose because once I'd sort of set out the arc of the series, like The Girl, the Dog, and the Writer, my mind just sort of followed that path. But I can imagine there may come a situation where I would think, oh, darn it, I should have done this earlier on in the series to set up a different long-term situation. But I haven't come across that so far. And I think that's really just that thing that once I've committed to it, that's the channel my thoughts go down and my creativity follows.
You finished your first draft. How much do you revise the book?
I don't do a great deal of revising because my process is quite back and forth throughout the novel anyway. So I know some people just quickly write their first draft and then do lots of re-editing. I don't work that way. If I feel like something's not working in my story, I can't move on. Often I reference things from the start all the way through and things become more tangled and embroiled in my plot. So if something's not right at the beginning, I can't really move on, because if that changes at the beginning, everything else will be affected. So my process is that I'm constantly editing as I go along. So I might write a chapter one day and I might spend the next 2 days going back over that chapter, making it as good as it can be. Or I might write a chapter one day and the next day I decide that really I can condense that chapter to one sentence and spend my words on something more important for the story. So I'm always editing throughout. So by the time I'm finished, I probably go back through the story once or twice, but it's just small tweaks that I'm making at that stage.
Which of your books do you think would make the best movie or television series?
I think the Traveling Bookshop series could be a really fun TV series for small children. I think there's so much colour and fun, and all the different travel scenes in that would be really fun. But I also would love to see my war stories turned into movies. I think We Are Wolves and Rabbit Soldier, Angel Thief and Waiting for the Storks would all make amazing movies for young people, because there's a young character at the centre of it. There's drama, there's suspense, there's sadness, there's joy. I think they'd be really exciting movies for children and hopefully for adults.
Finally, it's time for our Turbo 10.
10 rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
1. What's your favorite phrase to use?
There's an old Australian saying that you say when you're excited, which is wacko the diddly-o, which means that's really great.
2. What is one subject you'd love to learn more about?
The Soviet Union during World War II.
3. What's your go-to snack food?
Cheese and biscuits.
4. What was your favorite book growing up?
I didn't like books. I know that's phenomenal for you to hear an author say, but I didn't like books. I loved comics. I really loved Disney comics because they were funny and they were colourful and there was lots of action. And the books I was shown as a little girl were really, really boring. So my favourite books were comics. Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah. 5. If you could teleport somewhere right now, where would you go?
Norway, to a beautiful fjord, and I'd be living in a little red timber cottage and picking fresh apples off the trees and eating them.
6. If you had one superpower, what would it be?
Oh, invisibility. I think it'd be so great to be invisible. Sneak around and people wouldn't know you were there, but you could watch and listen, hide when you didn't want to be sociable. That would be lovely.
7. What was your favorite cartoon as a kid?
Oh, I loved Roadrunner. I don't know whether you know that one, Roadrunner with Wile E. Coyote. There was a lot of naughtiness and probably quite a bit of violence in that, but I used to think that was hilarious.
8. What was your favorite rainy day activity?
Watching TV, just snuggling up by the telly and watching cartoons. I loved cartoons.
9. If you could have any 3 dinner guests, who would they be?
Oh, that's a good one, isn't it? Can they be people who aren't alive anymore?
Of course.
No rules.
Okay, so I'd have Jane Austen, the author, and I would have Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of England during World War II, and I would have, Walt Disney.
10. What's the best piece of advice you were ever given?
Don't criticize people and be kind.
You did great. Thank you so much for doing that.
And Miss Nannestad, thank you for spending this time with us.
We appreciate
Oh, it's my
it.
pleasure. Thank you so much.
We appreciate it so much.
And we can't wait to read your future books.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I can't wait to see your future podcasts or your future videos.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye, guys.